Hello, it's good that you could join with us on this Remembrance season. The four of us pictured on the screen, we're going to have a chat about what remembrance means to us and how we let it lead us in our worship and in our lives. And for me, I'm going to start because I always find remembrance a very hard service. Not in terms of that I mourn the loss of people that I know, because none of my family that I know of have given their lives in the service of the country. I just find it very hard to get the right level of remembering the sacrifice without glorifying the war and the loss of life. And strangely, we've been in the parish of Cluny and Monymusk for almost 30 years now, and it was about 7 years ago that we found that a relative of my wife is actually on the Monymusk War Memorial, and so it became a wee bit more meaningful at that point. Not that we knew that at the time until the local undertaker told us that, but it's a difficult time for some, and it's an emotional time for some. So, Neil, how do you view remembrance? What does it mean to you?
Well, the odd thing for me is, of course, I'm in a sense a newcomer to the traditions of remembrance, certainly in the UK. Obviously, South Africa was involved in the wars, First and Second World Wars. And so Remembrance Day is celebrated there, but nothing like on the scale that it is in the UK. So I've also struggled to just kind of get my head around what people understand by remembrance here. So I understand your concern, Ewan. I guess look, I totally understand why people, why we need to remember those who have sacrificed in wartime, and that there's reason to do that. I guess what puzzles me most, coming from a South African perspective, is the relationship between church and state at a time like this. I have the South African background is that the church often saw itself in opposition to the state, certainly during the apartheid years. So, and there's a tradition of being critical of the state. And the one thing that troubles me most about Remembrance Day here, not so much in the church, but in the media, is the way that the church's role seems to be just on the side of the state. And I don't think everybody feels that way, but certainly it appears that way in the media sometimes to me.
Right. And Fiona, what about you? What's your view?
Well, yeah, I mean, my early memories of Remembrance Sunday was always being cold cold because I was a brownie and then a guide, and there was lots of marching to the War Memorial and freezing because we weren't allowed to wear jackets. So that was certainly as a sort of a youngster, that was my early sort of remembrances of it. But it is something which I have struggled with quite a lot, partly because in my family I have my grandfather was a conscientious objector, but he was also a volunteer in the fire brigade in London during the war. And I think that he's not something he ever spoke about an awful lot. I think it was something he found very hard. His brother did fight. He fought in India. But my great-grandfather was also a conscientious objector, having been an ambulance driver during the First World War. So from a personal point of view, I have very mixed feelings about not, as Ewan said earlier, not glorifying war in any way, shape or form. And I think that's really important. But I do think that in whatever way people sacrificed needs to be remembered. And for some people, that was a sacrifice of life. But there were people at home who've sacrificed a lot as well, sacrificed loved ones, but sacrificed their standing in society by standing up for what they truly believed. And I think it's really important to kind of take all of that, because all of that is caused by war, and all of that is damaging, and it needs healing from. And as a nation, we need to heal from that. Certainly, obviously, in more recent times, any conflicts more recently have been more of an individual or a family sacrifice. It's not been quite such a big national thing as it would have been during the World Wars, but there is still sort of our safety is being kept, and our personal freedoms are being kept by people who are willing to make sacrifices in lots and lots and lots of ways. So I think that's what a lot of remembrance has got to do for me, is a lot of tied up with just loss of life is not always the only sacrifice which people made, and it's important to remember all of them.
Thank you for that. I'm of an age, I remember that it seemed to be that the remembrance aspect was almost drifting away. You never really heard much of 2-minute silence in schools and things of that nature until the Iraq War started, and we saw the coffins coming back and going through, the towns with the people lining the streets, and then it seemed to become much more important again in the psyche of the nation to remember. Sheila, how does it affect you?
I think just listening to the three of you talking, actually, I think what you're all saying actually resonates a lot with me. I've always found Remembrance one of the most challenging services in the year to lead, and I think it's something about pitching it where you're not being too political, but you're being culturally sensitive. You're working with the local people and the local culture within a community. And actually, that's one of the big learnings, I think. Although remembrance, as Neil, as you're saying, is such a British thing in its entirety, we kind of think there's one blueprint. Actually, there's real subtleties in different communities about what's expected and how things are done and who's involved. And there is a really close alignment between church and state, in inverted commas, for remembrance. And it raises all sorts of questions for me, not because I'm anti-state in any way, but I wonder where the church's prophetic voice is in all of this in terms of talking about war or peace. And actually, to be perfectly honest, I would very often shy away from those comments or themes in remembrance, because somehow that feels almost inflammatory. And yet, why should it? Because these are central themes to human beings. And the church has really powerful things to say on the subject of peace, as well as in the subject of remembrance. Remembering is such a key theme to us as Christians, and to us as human beings, and across every culture, remembering is extremely important. And I think unless we remember, we can't change, we can't look ahead. So I think the act of remembering is incredibly important, however we mark it. But I think the culture is changing. I see different people incorporating different rituals, perhaps, in what they're doing. That's easier in some places and less easier in others. So, maybe we become the living embodiment of a change of ritual as time goes on, and maybe that's a good thing. Perhaps remembrance shouldn't stay static the way that it's always been or the way that it's always expected. There's maybe other ways which are equally dignified and appropriate to mark the occasion. So it's fascinating from a cultural and historic perspective, but at the same time, it's such an important and symbolic marker, I think, in the year, in terms of, we think of our own life, we think of the people that we've perhaps known who have served or indeed who have died, and we think of it from a state and then a global perspective as well. There's all sorts of themes and levels, I think, contained within remembrance. So it's interesting for me, it's fascinating, it's difficult, it's hard, it's challenging. I think it's all these things, to be perfectly honest.
Yes. It strikes me that the relationship between church and remembrance, I was always, early on in my ministry, surprised that I would see a set number of people in both churches who would only ever come to church for that service, for the remembrance, because it meant so much to them. And I mean, kind, decent, hard-working folk they were, but they didn't really, I'm not sure they came to worship, they came to remember, and it was probably it was part of their culture to do that. It's those folk have sadly passed on now, but it's still a big part of our culture, and I think the fact that you see it on the media now with railway stations on the 11th hour and the 11th day, and people standing about, we're being more, I'm not saying indoctrinated, but we're being more encouraged to do this. I mean, I've a couple of times in the last 2 years at Remembrance Day, people have said, well, did you stand up for 2 minutes at the 11th? I've forgotten all about it, to be frank, because I was on my own, I was in this study, and I never really thought too much about it. And when I said that to one person a couple of years ago, they were really quite annoyed that I had forgotten. But that's just me. It's as I said, it's not easy for me, remembrance, and it's not something that is high in my calendar of important events. But I recognise that it's important as the parish minister that I have my part to play in allowing people their ritual, their remembrance, and it is important to so many people.
I wonder how much of that is governed by things like time and generation. My girls have just been watching Downton Abbey. They've been binge watching that during the lockdown, and so there's the whole thing about the war and the putting up war memorials and things like that. And you have a sense that it was such an alive thing for the generation that went through it, and not just the First World War, but the Second World War too, and absolutely there was the need to remember, and it was as I said, it was an alive issue for those folk. I wonder how that has drifted in people's minds over the decades. And what are you remembering? And I think this is where the gospel does have to at least challenge people, to ask them, to put before them the question: is this about a kind of unquestioning sense of nationalism, which I would have problems with, or is it a true sense of repentance and pain and grief for the horrors that war visited on us and others? And I think that is a very valid question to ask people, because, as I say, I sometimes, in some of the way it is portrayed in society, I sometimes get the feeling that for some people it's nudging towards a sense of nationalism, national pride in our military, and less so what I understand in principle remembrance should be, the sense of loss and pain and grief.
And I think, Neil, that you've hit it. You've hit the nail on the head there. I think that's the tension that so many ministers feel, and trying to work out in a form of words that's dignified and respectful how to represent those things appropriately. It's interesting, just as an anecdote, the homily that I used for the worship actually is a story about Rudyard Kipling. And I was saying to some of the others earlier, he almost touched exactly on what it is that you're describing, because he lost a son, age 18, in his only son actually, in the war, and never was able to find him or know where he was buried within his lifetime. It was only after he died that John Kipling was identified. But paradoxically, it was Kipling who was tasked with working with Winston Churchill to come up with the titles and the inscriptions on the memorial. So his words were, known unto God. That was Kipling. And the words on the cenotaph in London as well were Kipling. But he absolutely struggled with the thought of war. And he struggled with the idea of that side of that sort of state involvement. And there's a kind of irony there, and I think it just illustrates beautifully that tension of the anger and the grief and the frustration of personal loss, and yet his legacy of some of the most beautiful and powerful words actually that contribute even yet today to remembrance. But he was a man who really believed that, and there's a quote I mentioned in the homily, one of his, I think it finishes, in other words, tell the people that the state has lied. That, and it's really, really difficult, but so human, such a human expression of the tensions that exist.
So I wonder then, we've spoken a bit about the generation that remembered, and obviously some of them are still with us. I don't know about you guys, but we have quite a lot of young people through the organizations, the Scouts and the Boys Brigades and all the Girls Guides and so forth. So I find one of the things at Remembrance Day is I'm talking a lot to the next generation. So I'm curious to hear, what do you guys feel our message from the church should be to the next generation in the context of remembrance?
I can't help but feel that a lot of it is to do with the importance of ritual. And this is, first of all, looking back to the older generations, the importance of the ritual, the security and the safety and the healing nature of a repetitive ritual, which we know comes around every year. And that's looking back to previous generations. But to answer your question about the new generations, I think there's a whole new, unfortunately, with things to do with terrorism and things like that, there's a whole new type of thing to remember, of violence and things to remember. And it's this we must never forget thing, because if we forget, then it can be repeated. And I think that that's where it comes from for future generations. And I mean, we see it in discussions about the Holocaust and things like that. And, even, it's quite scary to think that, our children and that don't remember the 9/11. And for them, that's history. Whereas for us, that's very much a present. And it's so quickly these things slip out of memory. They slip from being an experience to being a memory, to being something my parents remembered, being something my grandparents remembered. And I think that that's where remembrance comes in, is it actually brings it back into the present, and we connect what's happened in the past to what is now happening in the present. And we try and prevent it from happening in the future, by humanizing it, by putting names to it, by saying that this is real. These were real people. Maybe going back, my great grandfather was, or my great great grandfather was in the First or Second World War, or whatever, however the generation is working. I knew somebody, I know somebody, I know, I can connect to this event. And if we can connect to the events, then we can remember them. And if we remember them, then hopefully we learn not to repeat our mistakes. But human history does not, unfortunately, show that is the case. But that is the hope, and that is the importance of remembering, is to not repeat our mistakes.
I've never really given too much thought about preaching to the next generation, if I'm totally honest. At these services, we have the guides come to Minimusk, but they used to come to Minimusk, and I one of the ones you used a wee while back, Neil, was repentance. I've never thought of it in these terms, the Remembrance Service, and that's something that's made me think about what we've got to do. I think as in life, it's a balance. Am I speaking to the generation who need it, or am I speaking to the next generation who perhaps think that they're just, as Fiona was in her younger days, freezing cold at the remembrance experience. And some of the girls with us, I'm sure a lot of them were wondering why they were in church during a service of remembrance. But I still think there's a place for it. But it's you know it's necessary in terms of sharing memories. But I think it's frightening if it's going to be used. We're seeing a world that's becoming much more nationalist, and I fear that there's a temptation to tap into that stream of consciousness now, that we're okay and we've got to look after ourselves and we'll forget everybody else. And if we become too jingoistic about war, we're feeding that sort of culture, which seems to me so sad that it's becoming so international. It's not just in our land or in other big lands, but in small countries as well. And I think we've got to balance it. But I really don't know, is the honest answer, how I speak to the next generation, and whether they'd actually listen.
I think we have a generation, Ewan, as well, that identifies war perhaps in a different way, more in terms of conflict, because wars are not now, I suspect, as definable as starting in one year and finishing with a truce in another year. We're in a different kind of world, and therefore the understanding of younger people now is potentially quite different. For me, I've always tried to open up remembrance to acknowledge, at least in some way, other conflicts in the world and the ongoing death in conflict. And I tend to use that word rather than war as a way of trying to connect to what's happening in the present, and rooting remembrance not just all those years ago in the world wars, which yes, we should remember, but I think if remembering has any power at all, then all the people who are lost in conflict deserve remembrance, even if they are nameless or faceless to us. And I think that's important. To me as a Christian, that's important. I want to acknowledge that loss of life in its widest form.
Folks, I think we've given a flavour of how we interpret remembrance. Everybody watching this no doubt will have their own understanding and their own expectations of remembrance. And as it says, we will remember. How we do it is open for discussion and debate, but it is important to so many people. So thanks very much for joining with us on this day of remembrance, and we hope to do some of these on some other topic in the future. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.